The train lurched to a stop with a grinding scream of iron on iron, and Clara Whitmore felt her stomach clench, not from the motion, but from the finality of it. This was the end of the line, literally. A hand-painted sign barely visible through the dust-caked window read, Ashford Station, though station was generous. It was a wooden platform baking under the Arizona sun, a water tower that looked half dead, and a single building that might have been a depot or might have been someone's abandoned shed. She pressed her palm against the warm glass, scanning the platform. He would be there. Ethan Rourke, the man she'd written to for 6 months, whose letters had been stiff but steady, who'd proposed through careful script on cream-colored paper because he needed a wife and she needed, well, she needed a lot of things. A home, a future, a place where people didn't look at her like she was already broken. The other passengers were already standing, pulling down bags, adjusting hats, eager to escape the suffocating heat of the car. Clara stayed seated a moment longer, her hand moving to the small bundle in her lap, everything she owned wrapped in a faded shawl. Inside was a single change of clothes, her mother's silver hairpin, and tucked in the corner, a simple gold band she'd bought with the last of her savings. Just in case he didn't have one. Stupid, maybe. Presumptuous, definitely. But hope made people do stupid things. She stood carefully, feeling the familiar pull in her left hip. The way her leg didn't quite move the way it should. An old injury, a fall from a hayloft when she was 12 that never healed right. The limp wasn't terrible. She could walk, could work, could do most things if she was careful, but it was visible. Always visible. He knows, she reminded herself. You told him in the 3rd letter. He said it didn't matter. She stepped into the aisle, holding the seatbacks for balance as the train swayed. A woman in a green traveling suit gave her a quick, pitying glance before looking away. Clara kept her face neutral. She'd had a lifetime of those looks. The heat hit her like a wall when she stepped onto the platform. Dry, vicious, the kind that sucked moisture from your mouth in seconds. She squinted against the glare, scanning the handful of people waiting. A family reunion happening near the depot. An old man with a wagon, a young boy holding a sign for some businessman who hadn't arrived. And there, standing apart from everyone else, next to a horse that was better groomed than most of the people, was Ethan Rourke. She knew him from the single photograph he'd sent. Tall, solid build, dark hair under a wide-brimmed hat, the kind of face that didn't smile much even when it was supposed to. He was watching the train, arms crossed, expression unreadable. Clara's heart kicked hard in her chest. She raised a hand slightly, not quite a wave, just enough to catch his attention. He saw her. She watched his eyes track her face, her shoulders, her dress, and then down. To the way she was standing, the way her weight was shifted, the way her left foot was angled just slightly wrong. His expression didn't change, but something in his posture did. A subtle shift backward, a fraction of an inch, like he'd just realized he was standing too close to something unpleasant. Clara's hand dropped. She stepped forward anyway, gripping her bundle tighter, trying to walk as evenly as she could. The platform felt a mile long. Every step was measured, deliberate. She could feel his eyes on her, cataloging every imperfection. Mr. Rourke? Her voice came out steadier than she felt. He looked at her for a long silent moment. Then he looked past her, toward the train, as if expecting someone else to appear. You're Clara Whitmore. It wasn't a question, it was an accusation. Yes. She tried to smile. It felt like cracking plaster. I got your letters. All of them. I brought the last one in case there was any. You didn't mention it was that bad. The words landed like a slap. Clara's breath caught. I told you I had a limp in my letter. You said, I thought you meant a little stiffness, something that didn't show. The world narrowed to his face, to the disgust that was barely concealed now, to the way he was already stepping back toward his horse. Mr. Rourke, please, I need a wife who can work. Full days. A ranch doesn't run on half effort. I can work. I've been working my whole life. I can cook, clean, mend, garden. I need someone who can stand at a stove for hours without sitting down, who can haul water, who can keep up. I can keep up. No. He said it flatly, like he was refusing a bad horse. You can't. He turned toward his mount, one hand already on the saddle horn. Clara stepped forward, ignoring the pain in her hip. Wait, please, I came all this way. That was your mistake. He swung up into the saddle with practiced ease, not looking at her. There's a boarding house 2 streets south. Mrs. Callahan might have a room, or the train back east leaves Wednesday. I don't have money for either of those things. I spent everything I had getting here. For a second, just a second, something that might have been guilt flickered across his face. Then it was gone, replaced by cold practicality. Not my problem. He turned the horse and rode away. Just like that. No apology. No explanation beyond the obvious. No acknowledgement that he'd promised her something, that she'd rearranged her entire life based on his word. Clara stood on the platform, bundle clutched to her chest, and watched him disappear into the wavering heat. The few people still nearby were staring now, openly, hungrily, the way crowds always watch disasters unfold. The old man with the wagon shook his head and looked away. The woman in the green suit whispered something to her companion. Even the boy with the sign was watching, wide-eyed and curious. Clara's throat was tight, her eyes burning, but she refused to cry. Not here, not in front of them. She turned and limped toward the depot building because standing still felt like surrender. The inside of the depot was barely cooler than the outside, just shadowed. A single clerk sat behind a wire cage looking bored and hot. He glanced up when Clara entered, taking in her appearance with a quick, dismissive sweep. Help you? I need to know where the boarding house is. Mrs. Callahan's place. He jerked his thumb vaguely south. 3 blocks. Yellow house with a porch. She's probably full, though. Doesn't take just anybody. I can pay. A lie, but she'd figure something out. Sure. He was already looking back down at his ledger, done with her. Clara walked back outside, blinking against the sun. 3 blocks. She could do 3 blocks. The town of Ashford was exactly what she'd expected from Ethan's letters. A single main street of sun-bleached wood and peeling paint, false-fronted buildings trying to look bigger than they were, dust thick enough to taste. A general store, a saloon, a smithy with a half-dead horse tied out front, a church that looked newer than everything else, a handful of houses scattered beyond. And everyone was watching her. A group of men outside the saloon went quiet as she passed. A woman sweeping her porch stopped mid-stroke, eyes narrowing. 2 children playing in the street actually pointed. Clara kept her chin up and kept walking, even though every step was starting to hurt. The heat wasn't helping. Neither was the uneven ground, the ruts in the street that made her gait even more obvious. The yellow house was easy to find. It did have a porch, and sitting on that porch in a rocking chair was a woman who could only be Mrs. Callahan, 60-ish, iron gray hair pinned severely back, dress buttoned to the throat despite the heat, expression like she'd just bitten into something sour. Clara stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. Mrs. Callahan? The rocking stopped. Sharp blue eyes raked over Clara from head to toe, lingering on all the wrong places. If you're looking for work, I don't need help. I'm looking for a room. I can pay. Still a lie. Can you? It wasn't a question. Mrs. Callahan resumed rocking slowly. You're the mail-order bride, aren't you? The one Ethan Rourke sent for. Word traveled fast in small towns. Clara didn't bother denying it. Yes, ma'am. And I'm guessing he took one look and decided he'd made a mistake. The bluntness of it was almost worse than Ethan's rejection. At least he'd had the decency to couch it in practical terms. Mrs. Callahan was just stating facts. Yes, ma'am. The older woman made a small knowing sound. Men are particular about what they're willing to live with. Can't say I blame him. A rancher needs a strong back, not... She waved a hand vaguely at Clara. Charity. Clara's hands tightened on her bundle. I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking for a room. I'll pay. With what? You just said you spent everything getting here. Caught. Clara opened her mouth, closed it. There was no good answer. Mrs. Callahan leaned forward slightly. I'll tell you what I tell every girl who shows up here thinking she's going to find something better. This town doesn't owe you anything. You're not special. You're not wanted. And if you're smart, you'll get on that Wednesday train and go back to wherever you came from before you starve to death. I can work. Doing what? The words cracked like a whip. Every business in this town already has the help they need. Nobody's going to hire a crippled girl who can't stand for a full shift. Nobody's going to take a chance on someone who might collapse halfway through the day. You're a liability, not an asset. The word crippled hit like a punch. Clara had heard it before, of course, had heard worse, but it never stopped cutting. I'm stronger than I look. I'm sure you think you are. Mrs. Callahan stood, brushing dust from her skirt. But thinking doesn't pay rent. I've got 2 rooms left, and I'm not wasting one on someone who'll be gone in a week. Find somewhere else. She turned and walked inside, the screen door slapping shut behind her. Clara stood there, alone on the street, the sun hammering down and her hips screaming and absolutely nowhere to go. She spent the first night under the platform at the train station. It wasn't a decision so much as a lack of options. By the time the sun started to set, she'd tried every business on the main street. The general store didn't need help. The saloon wouldn't hire a woman who wasn't willing to work upstairs, and when Clara said no, the owner laughed in her face. The church was locked. The few houses that looked prosperous enough to have servants already had them. Nobody wanted her. So she limped back to the depot, waited until the clerk left for the night, and crawled into the narrow space beneath the platform where the ground was at least level, and the wood above blocked some of the wind. She used her bundle as a pillow and tried not to think about how far she'd fallen. 2 days ago, she'd had a future, a plan, a man waiting. Now she had dirt under her cheek and splinters in her palms, and the very real possibility that she was going to die in this godforsaken town. She didn't cry. There was no point. Tears didn't change anything. But she didn't sleep much either. Tossed. The second day was worse. She woke up stiff and sore, her hip a knot of pain from sleeping on hard ground. Her stomach was empty. She hadn't eaten since the train, and her mouth was so dry her tongue stuck to her teeth. She crawled out from under the platform just as the sun was coming up, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that were almost pretty if you ignored the fact that they heralded another day of brutal heat. The depot clerk arrived an hour later, saw her sitting on the platform, and told her to move along. Clara moved. She walked, limped, back into town, trying to look purposeful even though she had no purpose. Trying to look like she belonged even though everyone she passed knew she didn't. A man loading crates onto a wagon actually spat in the dirt as she went by. She stopped at the general store thinking maybe she could ask for credit, just enough for some bread and water. The owner, a thin man with suspenders and a permanent scowl, listened to her request and then pointed to the sign behind him. No credit. I'll pay you back as soon as I find work. Then come back when you've found work. Please, I haven't eaten in 2 days. He looked her up and down, expression flat. Not my problem. The same words Ethan had used. Apparently it was the town motto. Clara walked out, vision swimming slightly. Dehydration, probably. The heat was worse today, or maybe she was just weaker. She found a horse trough near the smithy and drank from it when no one was looking. The water was warm and tasted like metal, but it helped. For a while she just sat in the shadow of the smithy's wall, watching the town move around her, watching people go about their lives, buying things, talking, working, existing, while she faded into the background like a ghost. A dog wandered over and sniffed her. She scratched its ears and it stayed for a while, the first bit of kindness she'd felt in days. When it finally left, she felt the loss like a physical thing. By the afternoon, Clara had made a decision. She wasn't going to sit here and wait to die. She wasn't going to crawl back east with her tail between her legs. And she sure as hell wasn't going to let this town decide she was worthless. If no one here would give her a chance, she'd make her own. She'd overheard people talking at the general store, ranchers complaining about workers who'd quit or died or run off. One name had come up more than once, Caleb Vance, a man with a failing ranch about 5 miles outside town, up in the foothills. Word was he was dying. Infection from a badly set broken arm, fever, the kind of slow decline that happened when you were too stubborn to ask for help and too poor to pay a doctor. Nobody was willing to go out there. The ranch was falling apart. Vance was supposedly half mad with pain. There was no money in it, which meant he was desperate, and desperate people didn't have the luxury of being picky. Clara stood up, ignoring the protest from her hip, and started walking. 5 miles didn't sound like much. 5 miles in the Arizona heat, on an empty stomach, with a bad leg and no real idea of where you were going, was a different story. Clara followed the main road out of town until it split, then took the eastern fork based on half-remembered directions from the conversation she'd overheard. The road was barely a road, more like a suggestion of where wagons had passed before. Ruts and rocks and dust that rose in clouds with every step. The sun was relentless. She'd wrapped her shawl around her head to block some of it, but it didn't help much. Sweat soaked through her dress. Her vision kept going hazy at the edges. She stopped twice to rest, sitting on rocks by the side of the road, breathing hard and trying not to think about how stupid this was. If she was wrong about the directions, she'd die out here. If Vance turned her away, she'd have to walk back, and she wasn't sure she had the strength for that. But she kept going, because what else was there? The ranch appeared suddenly, almost like a mirage, a cluster of buildings in a shallow valley backed by rust-colored hills. A house, a barn, a few outbuildings, fences that had half collapsed, fields that had gone to weeds. It looked exactly like a place where someone was dying alone. Clara stopped at the edge of the property, swaying slightly, and took it in. No animals that she could see. No movement. Just stillness and decay and the sense of something slowly giving up. She started down the long drive. The house was worse up close. Peeling paint, sagging porch, windows so dirty you couldn't see through them. The front door was ajar, hanging crooked on its hinges. Clara stopped at the base of the porch steps. Hello? No answer. She climbed the steps carefully, testing each one. The wood groaned but held. Mr. Vance, my name is Clara Whitmore. I'm looking for work. Still nothing. She pushed the door open. The smell hit her first. Sweat, sickness, something rotten. The kind of smell that meant infection, fever, flesh that wasn't healing right. The inside of the house was dark, shutters closed against the heat. It took her eyes a moment to adjust. When they did, she saw him. Caleb Vance was on a cot near the cold fireplace, half covered by a filthy blanket, one arm twisted at an angle that made Clara's stomach turn. His face was gray, slicked with sweat, eyes closed. For a second, she thought he was already dead. Then his chest moved, shallow, labored breaths. Clara stepped inside, letting the door swing shut behind her. Mr. Vance? His eyes opened, barely, unfocused, glassy with fever. He tried to speak, but it came out as a rasp. Clara moved closer, kneeling beside the cot. Up close, it was worse. His arm was swollen, purple-black in places, the skin tight and shiny. Infection. Bad infection. The kind that killed you if you didn't deal with it fast. When did you break this? He blinked slowly, like the question was coming from very far away. Week? Maybe 2 weeks. Jesus. The bone had probably started to set wrong, and the infection had taken hold, and now it was spreading through his whole system. Has a doctor seen it? A bitter, broken sound that might have been a laugh. Can't afford. Clara sat back on her heels, thinking fast. She wasn't a doctor. She had no training, no tools, no supplies. But she'd grown up on a farm, had seen her father deal with infections in livestock, knew the basics. Clean the wound, drain the infection, keep it from spreading, and if that didn't work, sometimes you had to cut. She looked around the room, filthy dishes piled in the corner, dust thick on every surface. No clean water, no bandages, nothing. This man was going to die, unless someone helped him. Clara stood up, her decision made. I'm going to need a fire, clean water, and something I can use as bandages. Vance's eyes found hers, confusion and suspicion warring in his fevered gaze. Who? Someone who doesn't want to watch you die. She moved toward the fireplace, looking for wood. And someone who needs a place to stay. So if I save your life, you're giving me a job. Deal? He stared at her for a long moment, then barely audible. Deal. Not. The first thing Clara did was open every window and shutter in the house, letting light and air flood in. Vance groaned at the brightness, but she ignored him. The place smelled like death. It needed to breathe. The second thing she did was find the well, a rickety structure behind the house with a bucket that looked like it hadn't been used in days. She hauled up water, bucket after bucket, her arms screaming in protest, but her grip steady. She brought it inside, started a fire in the hearth using the last of the dry wood stacked near the door, and set the largest pot she could find to boil. While the water heated, she searched the house. Most of it was useless. Broken furniture, empty shelves, mice droppings. But she found a few things she could work with. A bottle of whiskey, half full. A sewing kit with a needle and thread. A straight razor that was dull but could be sharpened. And in a chest under the bed, a set of clean, if moth-eaten, linens. She tore the linens into strips, boiled them in the water, and set them aside to dry near the fire. Then she turned her attention to Vance. He was barely conscious now, muttering in fever dreams, his body shaking despite the heat. Clara pulled back the blanket and examined his arm. It was worse than she'd thought. The break was near the elbow, and whoever had set it, if anyone had done a terrible job. The bone was crooked, pressing against the skin in places, and the infection? It had spread from the initial wound, a ragged gash that had probably happened when he fell, creating an angry red web that stretched from his wrist halfway to his shoulder. If she didn't do something, the infection would hit his blood, and then he'd be dead in days. Clara took a breath, steadied herself, and went to work. First, she cleaned the wound with boiled water, wiping away the crust of dried blood and pus. Vance screamed, a raw, animal sound, and tried to pull away, but he was too weak. Clara held him down with one hand, her own strength surprising her, and kept working. When the wound was as clean as she could get it, she poured whiskey over it. Vance convulsed, his back arching, a string of curses pouring from his mouth that would have made a sailor blush. Clara gritted her teeth and kept going. The bone had to be reset. She could see it now, the jagged edge pressing against the skin. If she left it like that, it would never heal right, and the infection would just keep spreading. She had no training for this, no real idea if she could do it. But she'd seen her father do it once, years ago, with a farmhand who'd gotten kicked by a horse. Pull. A line. Set. Clara positioned herself, gripped Vance's arm above and below the break, and pulled. The scream that came out of him was inhuman. But the bone shifted. She felt it move under her hands, the pieces sliding back into something that resembled the right position. Not perfect, probably not even good, but better than it was. She held it there, sweat dripping into her eyes, muscles trembling, while she used strips of boiled linen to bind it tight. Splints made from pieces of broken furniture, more linen wrapped around those. When she was done, Vance had passed out, his face gray and slicked with sweat. Clara sat back, breathing hard, her hands shaking. It wasn't enough. The infection was still there, still spreading. She could see it in the red lines creeping up his arm, the heat radiating from the skin. She needed to drain it. The razor was dull, but she sharpened it as best she could on a whetstone she found in the barn. Then she heated the blade in the fire until it glowed, let it cool just enough to touch, and went back to Vance's side. She pressed the blade against the worst of the swelling and cut. Pus and blood welled up, thick and foul-smelling. Clara's stomach lurched, but she didn't stop. She pressed around the wound, draining as much as she could, then cleaned it again with whiskey and boiled water. Vance didn't wake up. Maybe that was a mercy. She bandaged the wound with the last of the clean linen, checked his breathing, shallow but steady, and then finally allowed herself to sit down. Her whole body ached. Her hands were covered in blood. Her dress was ruined. But Caleb Vance was still alive. For now, The next 3 days blurred together. Clara slept in snatches, on the floor near the fireplace, waking every few hours to check on Vance. His fever spiked and broke and spiked again. Sometimes he was lucid enough to drink the water she pressed to his lips. Most of the time he wasn't. Once, in the middle of the night, he woke up thrashing, eyes wild, convinced she was trying to kill him. He grabbed her wrist with his good hand, squeezed hard enough to bruise, and tried to throw her off. Clara fought back, used her weight, her elbows, anything she could, until he collapsed again, too weak to keep going. She didn't leave. She kept the fire going, kept boiling water, kept changing his bandages. The infection was stubborn, but it was draining. The angry red lines were fading, the swelling going down. He was fighting, and so was she. On the 4th day, his fever finally broke for good. Clara woke to find him watching her, eyes clear for the first time since she'd arrived. "You're still here," he said. His voice was rough, but it was his voice, not the fever dream rasp. Clara sat up, wincing as her hip protested. "Where else would I be?" "Gone. Most people would have left by now." "I'm not most people." He studied her for a long moment. Then, "You saved my life." "Maybe. Or maybe you were just too stubborn to die." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. Who are you? Clara Whitmore. I told you when I got here, but you probably don't remember. I remember bits. You said you needed a job. I do. Why? She could have lied, could have made herself sound better, more capable, less desperate, but she was too tired for that. Because the man I came here to marry took one look at me and decided I wasn't worth it. Because this town won't hire me. Because I have nowhere else to go. She met his eyes. And because I didn't want to watch you die alone. Vance was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded, slow and deliberate. You've got the job. Clara felt something loosen in her chest, something she hadn't realized was wound so tight. What does it pay? Room and board, and a share of whatever this place makes, if we can get it running again. That's not much. It's all I've got. Clara looked around the room, at the filthy floors, the broken furniture, the layers of dust and neglect. Then she looked back at Vance, at the man who'd been hours from death, and was now sitting up, weak but alive. It's enough, she said. And for the first time since she'd stepped off that train, Clara Whitmore smiled. The first real conversation they had was about chickens. Caleb was sitting up in bed, still weak, still gray around the edges, but alive enough to be opinionated, when Clara came in from the yard carrying a bucket of dubious-looking water from the well. There's a coop out back, he said without preamble, or what's left of one. Had 6 hens before I got laid up. Coyotes probably got them by now. Clara set the bucket down, wiping sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand. If there are any left, we'll need to fix the coop first. Half the slats are missing. Can't fix what we don't have wood for. Then we'll make do with what's here. There's plenty of broken fence posts rotting in the east field. He looked at her like she'd suggested building a barn out of spit and prayers. You know anything about carpentry? No. Do you? Not much. Then I guess we'll figure it out together. Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, but close. You always this stubborn? Only when I'm trying not to die. Clara picked up the bucket again, her hip protesting the weight. And for the record, you're not allowed to die either. I didn't drag you back from the edge just to watch you give up over chickens. Yes, ma'am. She left him there, shaking his head, and went back outside. The ranch was worse in daylight than it had seemed that first day. The barn roof had a hole the size of a wagon wheel. The fences weren't just collapsed, they were skeletal, held together by rust and stubbornness. The fields were choked with weeds taller than Clara's waist, and what might have once been a vegetable garden was now just a patch of hard-packed dirt and thorns. But there was also possibility buried under all that ruin. The well still worked. The house had good bones under the filth. The land itself was decent, rocky, sure, but not impossible. If they could get water to the fields, if they could clear the weeds, if they could fix even half of what was broken. Clara stopped herself. That was a lot of ifs. She found the chicken coop behind the barn, and Caleb had been right. It was a disaster. 3 walls still standing, barely. The 4th was gone entirely, just a scatter of wood and wire in the dirt. The roof had caved in on one side. But there were chickens. 2 of them, skinny and wild-eyed, roosting in what was left of the rafters. They fixed her with identical stares of deep suspicion. Well, Clara said to them, at least you're alive. One of them made a noise that sounded like an insult. Clara spent the rest of the morning pulling apart the ruined sections of fence in the east field, dragging the salvageable posts back to the coop. The work was brutal. Her hands blistered, then bled. Her hips screamed at her with every step. The sun beat down without mercy. She didn't stop. By the time the light started to fade, she'd managed to patch the worst of the gaps in the coop walls. It wasn't pretty. The posts didn't match, the spacing was uneven, and she'd had to use old rope instead of nails for half of it. But it would keep coyotes out. Probably. The chickens watched the whole process from their perch, unimpressed. You're welcome, Clara told them. They didn't respond. She limped back to the house, every muscle aching, and found Caleb asleep again. That was normal. Recovery wasn't a straight line. He'd be awake for an hour, then unconscious for 3. Progress, the slow kind. Clara heated the last of the beans she'd found in the pantry, hard as rocks, half of them probably older than she was, and forced herself to eat. They tasted like dirt and regret, but food was food. Then she collapsed on the floor near the fireplace and didn't wake up until dawn. The pattern repeated itself for days. Clara worked. Caleb recovered. The ranch stayed broken, but slightly less so with each passing day. She cleared the weeds from the garden patch, though she had no seeds to plant. She patched the barn roof with wood from the collapsed outhouse. She hauled water until her arms felt like they'd fall off, then hauled more. She learned which floorboards in the house were rotten and which would hold weight. She discovered a root cellar that still had 3 jars of preserves that hadn't gone bad and nearly cried with relief. And slowly, so slowly she almost didn't notice, Caleb got stronger. First he could sit up without help, then he could stand, leaning heavily against the wall, his legs shaking but holding. Then he could make it to the porch, where he'd sit in the sun and watch Clara work, offering occasional commentary that was only sometimes helpful. "You're planting those posts too shallow," he said one afternoon, his voice still rough but stronger than it had been. "First strong wind will knock them over." Clara straightened, wiping sweat from her eyes. "Then come out here and show me how deep they should be." "Can't. Doctor's orders." "You haven't seen a doctor." "Your orders, then." She pointed the post hole digger at him. "My orders are that you stop criticizing unless you're willing to help." He held up his bandaged arm in mock surrender. Point taken. But the next morning, he came outside. Not far, just to the edge of the porch, gripping the railing with his good hand. But it was something. Clara was trying to muscle a beam into place on the barn roof, balanced on a ladder that swayed with every movement. "That's a 2-person job," Caleb called up to her. "Good thing I count as 2 people then." "Clara." She looked down. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Concern, maybe, or frustration, or something else entirely. "You're going to fall and break your neck, and then we'll both be useless." "I'm not going to fall." "You're standing on a ladder that's half rotted, holding a beam that weighs more than you do, with a bad leg. The math doesn't work." Clara's jaw tightened. "I've been doing fine so far." "Fine isn't the same as smart." They stared at each other for a long moment. Then Clara climbed down, slowly, and dropped the beam in the dirt. "You want to help? Then help. Otherwise, let me work." Caleb's expression shifted, something like guilt crossing his face. "I didn't mean—" "Yes, you did." Clara's voice was sharper than she'd intended, but she was tired and sore and sick of being told what she couldn't do. "Everyone means it. I'm used to it." She turned and walked away, heading toward the well, needing distance. Behind her, she heard Caleb swear softly. But he didn't follow. That night, after a silent dinner of more terrible beans and some dried meat that might have been edible once, Caleb spoke from his cot. "I'm sorry." Clara was sitting by the fire, mending a tear in her dress with the last of the thread from the sewing kit. She didn't look up. "For what?" "For making you feel like you're not capable. You've done more in 2 weeks than I could have done in 2 months, even healthy." She tied off the thread, examining her stitches in the firelight. They were crooked, but they'd hold. "You were right, though. That beam was too heavy. I probably would have fallen. Maybe. Or maybe you would have figured it out, like you've figured out everything else." Clara finally looked at him. He was propped up on one elbow, his face half-shadowed, eyes serious. "I spent my whole life being told what I can't do," she said quietly. "By my family, by strangers, by men who looked at me for 5 seconds and decided I wasn't worth their time. So when you say things like that, even if you're right, all I hear is that you're not enough." She nodded. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then, "You're the toughest person I've ever met, and I've met some pretty tough people." Clara's throat tightened. She looked back at the fire. "Don't let it go to your head," Caleb added, and she could hear the faint smile in his voice. "You're also terrible at carpentry." Despite herself, Clara laughed. It came out rough and surprised, but it was real. "Go to sleep, Vance." "Yes, ma'am." Things were easier after that. Not easy. Nothing about the ranch was easy, but the tension between them had shifted into something more like partnership. Caleb stopped offering criticism and started offering advice, which Clara discovered she could actually tolerate. And when he was strong enough to stand for more than a few minutes, he started helping. Small things at first. Holding boards steady while Clara hammered, checking the fence posts she'd set to make sure they were deep enough, feeding the chickens, which had grown from 2 to 4 after Clara found 2 more hiding in the barn loft. Then bigger things. Together, they finished patching the barn roof. Together, They cleared enough of the garden to make it usable. Together, they hauled rocks from the creek bed to reinforce the well. It still wasn't enough. The ranch needed money for seed, for livestock, for nails and wire, and 100 other things they didn't have. Caleb's savings were gone, spent on keeping himself alive before Clara arrived. Her savings had never existed. They were running on fumes and stubbornness, and eventually that would run out too. "We could sell something," Clara suggested one evening. They were sitting on the porch, watching the sun set over the hills, too tired to do anything else. "Like what?" "We don't own anything worth selling." "The land?" Caleb shook his head. "Mortgaged, and even if it wasn't, selling would mean giving up. I'm not ready to do that." "Then we need to make money some other way." "Doing what?" "Neither of us can leave the ranch long enough to work in town, and even if we could, they wouldn't hire you." Clara flinched. She knew he didn't mean it cruelly, he was just stating facts, but it still stung. "There has to be something." Caleb was quiet, staring out at the darkening hills. Then, "The cattle drive." "What cattle drive?" "Every fall, the big ranches drive their herds to the railhead in Prescott. They hire drovers for the journey. Anyone who can ride and handle livestock. Pays decent if you survive it. So we hire on." "I can't ride yet. Arm's not strong enough. And you—" He stopped himself. "And I can't ride because of my leg." "I didn't say that." "You were going to." He didn't deny it. After a moment he said, "Even if you could, they wouldn't take you. Cattle drives don't hire women." Clara felt the familiar frustration building in her chest. Every door closed. Every opportunity blocked. Every path marked with a sign that said, "Not for you." "Then what do we do?" Caleb didn't have an answer. The silence stretched between them, heavy with all the things they couldn't fix. Finally, Clara stood. Her hip protested, but she ignored it. "I'm going into town tomorrow." Caleb looked up at her, surprised. "Why?" "Because sitting here waiting for the ranch to collapse isn't working. Maybe there's something I missed. Some job, some opportunity. I don't know, but I have to try." "Clara, see, I know what you're going to say. That it's pointless. That they won't hire me. That I'm wasting my time." She met his eyes. "But I'm going anyway." He studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded. "Take the wagon. It's falling apart, but it's better than walking. You need it here." "No, I need you to not collapse from heat exhaustion halfway to town. Take the wagon." Clara wanted to argue, but she was too tired. "Fine. Thank you. And Clara?" He waited until she looked at him. "Be careful. The town, they didn't treat you well before. Don't expect that to have changed." She knew he was right, but she also knew she didn't have a choice. The wagon was exactly as bad as Caleb had described. Wheels that wobbled, boards that creaked, a seat that had more splinters than wood. But it moved, pulled by the ancient mare they'd found wandering in the west pasture, and that was enough. Clara left before dawn, while Caleb was still asleep. The road into town was rough, and every bump sent pain shooting through her hip, but she gritted her teeth and kept the mare moving. Ashford looked exactly the same as it had 3 weeks ago. Same dusty street, same peeling paint, same suspicious faces turning to watch as she drove the wagon down the main road. Clara ignored them and headed straight for the general store. The owner, the same man who'd refused her credit before, looked up as she entered, his expression souring immediately. "You again. I need to talk to you about work." "Already told you, I don't need help." "What about supply runs? You must need someone to haul goods from the depot or make deliveries." "Got a boy who does that." "What about inventory, stocking shelves?" "Got that covered too." Clara forced herself to stay calm. "I'm a hard worker. I learn fast. I can do anything you need, except stand for a full shift without needing to sit down." There it was. The thing nobody said but everyone thought. "I can work longer than most people," Clara said, her voice steady even though her hands were shaking. "I've been rebuilding a ranch from nothing for 3 weeks, alone. I don't give up and I don't complain." The owner leaned back against the counter, arms crossed. "That's real inspiring, but I still don't need help." "Then who does? Someone in this town must need—" "Nobody needs a crippled girl who can barely walk. You want my advice? Go back to wherever you came from and stop wasting everyone's time." The words hit like a physical blow. Clara stood there, frozen, while the owner turned away and went back to arranging cans on a shelf. She walked out without another word. The next 3 hours were a repetition of the same scene. The saloon owner laughed in her face. The smithy told her to leave before she got hurt. The seamstress said she only hired girls who could work the treadle on a sewing machine, and Clara's leg wouldn't manage it. Every door closed, every opportunity denied. By noon, Clara was sitting on the wagon seat outside the church, staring at nothing, trying not to scream. She'd known it would be hard. She'd known they wouldn't welcome her. But some small, stupid part of her had hoped that maybe, just maybe, someone would see past the limp and give her a chance. That part had been wrong. "You're that mail-order bride." Clara looked up. A woman was standing a few feet away, middle-aged, plain dress, flour dust on her hands. She had the kind of face that had seen hard times and survived them. "Yes," Clara said, because there was no point denying it. "Heard Ethan Rourke left you at the station." "Yes." The woman nodded slowly, like this confirmed something she'd already suspected. "He's an ass." Clara blinked, surprised. "You're the first person in this town to say so." "Most people here care more about appearances than decency. Ethan looks good on paper, owns land, has money, goes to church. So they ignore the fact that he's cruel and shallow." She paused. "I'm Margaret, by the way. I run the bakery." "Clara?" "I know." Margaret glanced at the wagon, then back at Clara. "You're staying out at the Vance place?" "Yes." "How did you Small town. Word travels." Margaret hesitated, then said, "Is it true you saved his life?" Clara didn't know how to answer that. "I helped. He did most of the surviving himself." "That's not what I heard. Heard you walked 5 miles in the heat, half dead yourself, and pulled him back from the edge when everyone else had written him off." "Who told you that?" "Caleb came into town last week. Bought supplies on credit from the feed store. Told them you were working for him, that you'd earned it." Clara's chest tightened. Caleb hadn't mentioned going into town. Hadn't said anything about talking to people. Margaret watched her carefully. "You looking for work?" "Yes, but nobody's hiring." "I might be." Clara's head snapped up. "What?" "Bakery business has been good lately. Too good. I can't keep up with the orders on my own. I need someone who can mix dough, clean pans, help with deliveries." She paused. "It's hard work. Early mornings, hot ovens, a lot of standing." "I can handle it." "Can you? Because I need someone reliable. I can't afford to hire someone who's going to quit after a week because it's too hard." Clara stood up, ignoring the protest from her hip. "I walked 5 miles in the desert to save a man I'd never met. I spent 3 weeks rebuilding a ranch that was falling apart. I haven't quit yet, and I'm not going to start now." Margaret studied her for a long moment. Then she nodded. "Be here tomorrow morning, 4 o'clock. Don't be late." Clara's heart jumped. "You're serious?" "Dead serious. But if you can't do the work, I'll let you go. Fair?" "Fair." Margaret turned to leave, then stopped. "And Clara? Don't let this town break you. Most of them are small-minded fools. But a few of us—" She shrugged. "A few of us know what it's like to be judged for things we can't control." She walked away before Clara could respond. Clara stood there, stunned, the first real hope she'd felt in weeks blooming cautiously in her chest. She drove back to the ranch in a daze, barely noticing the rough road or the protesting wagon. When she arrived, Caleb was outside, trying to lift a bag of grain with one arm and failing. "You're back," he said, setting the bag down with obvious relief. "How did it—" "I got a job." He froze. "What?" "At the bakery. I start tomorrow." For a moment, Caleb just stared at her. Then a slow smile spread across his face, the first real smile she'd seen from him. That's incredible." "I know." Clara climbed down from the wagon, her whole body aching but her spirit lighter than it had been in weeks. "Margaret, the owner, she's giving me a chance." "Margaret's good people. Tough, but fair." Clara looked at him. "You went into town last week." Caleb had the decency to look slightly guilty. "Yeah." "You didn't tell me." "Didn't seem important." "You told people I was working for you, that I'd earned it." He shrugged, uncomfortable with the attention. "You had. Seemed like something they should know." Clara felt something shift inside her chest. Gratitude, maybe, or something warmer. "Thank you," she said quietly. Caleb looked away, suddenly very interested in the bag of grain. Don't mention it. Now, come help me with this before I drop it on my foot. Clara laughed and went to help him. That night, for the first time since arriving in Arizona, she fell asleep with something that almost felt like hope. The bakery job was everything Margaret had promised: brutal, exhausting, unforgiving. Clara arrived at 4 a.m, her hip already aching from the wagon ride into town. Margaret was waiting, the ovens already heating, dough already rising in massive bowls. "You're on time," Margaret said, sounding faintly surprised. "Good. Put on that apron and start mixing. Recipes on the board." The work was relentless, mixing dough until her arms burned, kneading until her hands cramped, loading and unloading the ovens, the heat so intense it made her eyes water, cleaning pans, scrubbing floors, hauling 50-pound sacks of flour. Her hips screamed at her, her back ached, her hands blistered and bled. She didn't stop. Margaret watched her carefully that first day, waiting, Clara could tell, for her to falter, to ask for a break, to admit it was too much. Clara didn't give her the satisfaction. By the time the sun set, she'd made it through a full shift. Barely. She could hardly walk by the end, her limp so pronounced that Margaret actually frowned. "You should rest tomorrow." "I'll be here at 4. "Clara." "I'll be here." Margaret sighed but didn't argue. Clara drove back to the ranch in the dark, every bump in the road agony. When she finally made it home, Caleb took one look at her and physically carried her into the house, despite her protests. "You're going to kill yourself," he said, setting her down on the cot. "I'm fine." "You can barely stand." "I'll be fine by morning." He crouched beside her, his expression serious. "You don't have to prove anything to them." "Yes, I do." Clara met his eyes. "Because if I don't, they'll use it as an excuse to get rid of me. One bad day, one moment of weakness, and it's over." Caleb looked like he wanted to argue. Instead, he just said, "Then I'll make sure you're ready." He spent the next hour heating water, making her soak her feet, rubbing salve into her blistered hands. He heated beans and forced her to eat. And when she finally fell asleep, he covered her with a blanket and let her rest. The next morning, Clara was back at the bakery at 4. And the next. And the next. Slowly, impossibly, her body adapted. The work was still hard, but it got easier. Her hands toughened. Her hips stopped screaming quite so loudly. She learned the rhythm of the bakery, when to push, when to pace herself, how to work smart instead of just hard. And Margaret, to her credit, noticed. "You're tougher than you look," she said one morning, 3 weeks in. Clara glanced up from the dough she was kneading. "Is that a compliment?" "From me?" "Yes." A small smile tugged at Clara's mouth. "Then thank you." Margaret nodded and went back to work. The money wasn't much, barely enough to cover supplies for the ranch, but it was something, more than they'd had before. Enough to buy seed for the garden, enough to fix the worst of the wagon, enough to feel like maybe, just maybe, they weren't drowning anymore. But the ranch still needed more. And then one afternoon, everything changed. Clara was finishing up at the bakery, scrubbing the last of the pans, when she heard raised voices outside. She wiped her hands and stepped into the front room. Through the window, she could see a group of men gathered in the street. One of them was Ethan Rourke. Her stomach dropped. Margaret appeared beside her, frowning. "What's he doing here?" "I don't know." But then Clara saw who Ethan was talking to, Caleb, standing in the bed of the wagon, his arms still bandaged but his posture rigid. And Ethan was yelling. Clara didn't think. She walked out into the street, her limp more pronounced than usual after a long day, and stopped a few feet from the wagon. "Don't care what you think you're owed," Ethan was saying, his voice loud enough to carry. "You bring her into town. You make us all look bad." Caleb's jaw was tight. "She works for me. She has every right to be here. She's a disgrace, a cripple who couldn't even—" "Finish that sentence," Caleb said quietly, "and I'll finish you." The street went silent. Ethan's face flushed red. "You threatening me, Vance?" "I'm stating a fact." Clara stepped forward. "Caleb, don't." Both men turned to look at her. Ethan's expression twisted into something ugly. "There she is, the woman who thought she was good enough to be my wife." Clara's hands clenched into fists. I thought a lot of things that turned out to be wrong. That's one of them. A few people in the gathered crowd snickered. Ethan's flush deepened. You've got nerve showing your face here. I work here. I earn my keep. What's your excuse? The snickers grew louder. Ethan took a step toward her, and Caleb moved, fast, despite his injury, putting himself between them. Back off, Caleb said. Or what? You'll fight me with one arm? I don't need two arms to handle you. For a moment, Clara thought Ethan might actually swing. His fists were clenched, his whole body tense with barely controlled rage. But then someone in the crowd laughed, really laughed, loud and genuine, and the tension broke. Ethan looked around, realized he was being mocked, and his expression shifted from anger to humiliation. This isn't over, he said, but it sounded hollow. He turned and stalked away, and the crowd began to disperse, still murmuring. Clara let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Caleb turned to her. You okay? I'm fine. Are you? He flexed his bandaged arm, wincing slightly. Yeah, just wish I'd actually hit him. Despite everything, Clara laughed. They drove back to the ranch in silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. If anything, it felt like they'd crossed some invisible line, from two people working together to something more solid. Partners. Maybe even friends. As the sun set behind them, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, Clara realized something. For the first time since stepping off that train, she didn't feel alone. The trouble started small, the way it always did in towns like Ashford. First, it was the feed store refusing to extend credit anymore. Caleb came back from town 2 days after the confrontation with Ethan, his jaw tight, a receipt crumpled in his fist. They want cash now, he said, tossing the paper onto the kitchen table. Said my account's been flagged as high risk. Clara looked up from the beans she was sorting, another batch from the seemingly endless supply in the pantry. Since when? Since yesterday, apparently. No explanation, just new policy. They both knew what it meant. Someone had applied pressure. Someone with enough influence to make a store owner nervous about who he did business with. Clara felt the familiar weight settling in her chest. This is because of me. This is because Ethan Rourke is a petty bastard who can't handle being laughed at. Same thing. Caleb pulled out a chair and sat down heavily, wincing as his arm shifted. It was healing, but slowly, and he still couldn't use it for anything that required real strength. We'll figure it out. How? We barely have enough cash to cover what we owe the bakery supplier, and that's with my wages. Then we'll make do with less. Clara stared at the beans, her hands still. Making do with less meant the ranch would keep sliding backward. It meant no seed for spring planting, no materials to fix the irrigation, no hope of actually building something that could sustain them. Maybe I should leave, she said quietly. Caleb's head snapped up. What? If I'm gone, they'll stop punishing you. You could get your credit back, rebuild relationships. No. Caleb, I said no. His voice was sharp, harder than she'd heard it before. You think running away fixes this? They'll just find someone else to push around. That's what people like Ethan do. They need someone beneath them to feel important. So we just accept being shut out? We fight back. Clara looked at him, saw the stubborn set of his jaw, the frustration in his eyes. He meant it. But fighting back required resources they didn't have. Before she could respond, they heard hoofbeats outside. Caleb stood, moving to the window. His posture went rigid. What is it? Clara joined him, peering through the dusty glass. 3 men on horseback were coming up the drive. She recognized one of them, the owner of the general store. The other 2 looked like ranch hands, the kind hired for muscle rather than skill. Stay inside, Caleb said. Like hell. She followed him onto the porch. Her hip was aching from the bakery shift that morning, but she kept her weight even, refusing to show weakness. The riders stopped a dozen yards from the house. The store owner, his name was Webb, Claire remembered, stayed mounted, looking uncomfortable. The 2 ranch hands flanked him, hands resting casually near their belts in a way that was clearly meant to be noticed. Vance, Webb said, his voice carrying across the yard. We need to talk. So talk. Webb glanced at Clara, then away, like looking at her directly was distasteful. This would be better in private. Anything you have to say to me, you can say in front of her. A muscle jumped in Webb's jaw. Fine. The business owners in town had a meeting last night. We've decided we can't keep extending credit to people who associate with undesirables. Undesirables. Caleb's voice was flat. You mean Clara? I mean anyone who brings trouble to Ashford. Your girl there, she's not my girl. She's my partner. Has been nothing but a disruption since she arrived. Ethan Rourke is a respected member of this community, and she humiliated him publicly. Ethan Rourke humiliated himself. We just watched. One of the ranch hands snorted, then covered it with a cough. Webb's expression darkened. The point is, you need to make a choice. Either she goes, or you're cut off. No credit, no supplies, no business dealings with anyone in town. Clara felt like she'd been punched. This wasn't just about the feed store. This was total isolation. And if I refuse, Caleb asked, then you'll fail. Your ranch is already hanging by a thread. Without access to supplies, you won't make it through winter. Webb paused. We're not trying to be cruel. We're trying to protect our own interests. You understand? I understand you're letting one man's wounded pride dictate how you treat people. Call it what you want, but those are the terms. The second ranch hand, who'd been silent until now, leaned forward in his saddle. Be smart, Vance. Girl's not worth losing everything over. Caleb's hands clenched into fists. Claire put a hand on his arm, stopping him before he could say something that would make things worse. We need time to think about it, she said. Webb looked at her like she'd just materialized out of thin air. This doesn't concern you. It concerns me plenty, since I'm the one being asked to leave. You're not being asked. You're being told. Clara's nails dug into her palms. Every instinct screamed at her to fight, to refuse, to tell them exactly where they could shove their ultimatum. But the practical part of her brain, the part that had kept her alive this long, knew that defiance right now would only hurt Caleb. How long do we have? She asked. 3 days. After that, the terms go into effect. Webb turned his horse without waiting for a response. The ranch hands followed, and within moments they were dust trails heading back toward town. Claire and Caleb stood on the porch in silence, watching them go. Finally, Caleb spoke. You're not leaving. We can't survive without supplies. We'll find another way. There is no other way. You said it yourself, the ranch is hanging by a thread. He turned to face her, his expression fierce. I don't care, you saved my life. You've worked yourself half to death keeping this place running. I'm not going to repay that by throwing you out because some townspeople decided to play power games. It's not about repayment, it's about survival. Exactly. And I'm not surviving alone again. His voice cracked slightly on the last word, revealing something raw underneath. I tried that. It doesn't work. Claire's throat tightened. She understood what he wasn't saying, that before she'd arrived he'd been giving up, that he'd been ready to let the infection take him, to let the ranch collapse, because fighting alone was too hard. There has to be another option, she said. Then we'll find it. Together. The word hung between them, solid and immovable. Clara nodded, not trusting her voice. They went inside, and for the next several hours they tried to figure out what the hell to do. The answer came from an unexpected source. Clara was at the bakery the next morning. Webb's ultimatum had given them 3 days, and she wasn't going to waste her remaining shifts when Margaret pulled her aside. I heard about what happened, Margaret said quietly, glancing toward the front of the shop where a customer was browsing. Clara's hand stilled in the dough she was kneading. Word travels fast. In Ashford, it travels at the speed of gossip, which is faster than anything else. Margaret wiped flour from her hands onto her apron. For what it's worth, I think they're being fools. Doesn't change the outcome. No, but it might change the options. Clara looked at her. What do you mean? Margaret hesitated, choosing her words carefully. There are people in this town who don't agree with what Webb and his cronies are doing. We just don't have the same kind of power they do. We? Me. Tom at the livery. Sarah, who runs the boarding house, not Mrs. Callahan, the other one on the north end. A few others. She paused. We're willing to help, quietly. Clara felt a flicker of something that might have been hope. How? I can keep you on here, pay you under the table. Tom can provide feed and supplies through back channels. Sarah can offer room if you need to stay in town some nights to avoid the ride. It won't be much, but it's something. Why would you risk it? Margaret's expression hardened. Because I've been where you are. 20 years ago, my husband died and left me with debt and a business that was failing. The town decided I was a bad investment. They tried to freeze me out, force me to sell. She met Clara's eyes. I survived out of spite, and I'll be damned if I watch them do the same thing to someone else. Clara's chest felt tight. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. This only works if you and Caleb are willing to fight for it, because they're going to push harder when they realize you're not folding. We're not folding. Good. Margaret handed her a cloth to clean her hands. Then get back to work, and tell Caleb to come see Tom tomorrow. Early, before the town wakes up. Clara worked the rest of the shift in a daze, her mind racing. It wasn't a perfect solution. Nothing about this situation was perfect, but it was a lifeline, a way to survive without giving in. When she got back to the ranch that evening, Caleb was in the barn trying to repair a broken stall door with one hand and a lot of frustration. Margaret and some others are willing to help, Clara said without preamble. Caleb looked up, surprise flickering across his face. What? She explained Margaret's offer, watching his expression shift from skepticism to cautious hope. They're willing to risk their own businesses? He asked when she finished. Apparently. He set down the hammer he'd been struggling with. Why? Because not everyone in this town is like Ethan Rourke. Caleb was quiet for a moment, processing. Then he nodded slowly. All right, then we fight. It's going to get ugly. It's already ugly. At least now we're not fighting alone. Clara felt something loosen in her chest, the constant tension that had been building since Webb's visit. They still had a mountain of problems, still faced impossible odds, but for the first time, it felt like they might actually have a chance. I'll go see Tom tomorrow, Caleb said. Figure out what we can get and how much it'll cost. And I'll keep working at the bakery. Clara, if they find out Margaret's helping us, they won't. She's careful. He looked like he wanted to argue, but didn't. Instead, he just said, all right. But if it gets dangerous, it's already dangerous. We're just choosing which risks to take. He smiled faintly. When did you get so practical? When I realized stubbornness only gets you so far, sometimes you need a plan too. Over the next few days, they built their quiet resistance. Tom at the livery provided feed through a series of complicated transactions that never appeared on official ledgers. Sarah at the boarding house let Clara rest between bakery shifts in a back room, saving her the brutal twice-daily wagon rides. Margaret paid her in cash that didn't go through any books. Money that went straight into supplies purchased from traveling merchants who didn't care about Ashford's politics. It wasn't easy. Every transaction required careful timing, every purchase needed to be disguised. Clara felt like she was living two lives. The public one where she was a burden and a troublemaker, and the private one where she was building something real. And then Ethan Rourke started showing up at the bakery. The first time, Clara thought it was coincidence. He walked in just before closing, bought a loaf of bread he clearly didn't need, and made a point of ignoring her completely. The second time, he brought friends. 3 other ranch owners, all of them loud and taking up space, talking about how hard it was to find good help these days, making pointed comments about people who didn't know their place. Margaret's expression went tight, but she served them without comment. The third time, Ethan came alone. He waited until the shop was empty except for Clara cleaning the back room. Margaret around? He called. Clara came to the doorway, wiping her hands. She's making a delivery. Then I'll wait. He settled onto one of the chairs near the window, stretching his legs out like he owned the place. Clara went back to cleaning, trying to ignore him, but she could feel his eyes on her, tracking her movements. Must be hard, he said after a few minutes, knowing you're the reason Vance is being shut out. Clara didn't respond. I mean, the man saved you, gave you a job when nobody else would, and this is how you repay him? By making him a pariah? She gripped the cleaning cloth tighter but kept working. He could still save himself, you know. All he has to do is send you away. Go back east. Find some other sucker to take pity on you. Clara turned to face him. Is there a point to this, or are you just here to hear yourself talk? Ethan's smile didn't reach his eyes. The point is you're selfish. You're clinging to a situation that's hurting everyone around you because you're too proud to admit you don't belong here. I belong here more than you think. You belong in a charity home somewhere back east, You don't belong on a ranch, and you certainly don't belong trying to make decisions that affect this community. Claire's jaw tightened. I'm not making decisions for anyone but myself. That's exactly the problem. You're only thinking about yourself. Not about what's best for Caleb, or for this town, or for anyone else. The door opened, and Margaret walked in carrying a crate. She took one look at Ethan, then at Clara, and set the crate down with more force than necessary. You need something, Rourke, or are you just wasting space? Ethan stood smoothly. Just making conversation. Claire and I were discussing her future. Her future's not your business. Everything that affects this town is my business. Then maybe you should worry more about your own shortcomings and less about hers. Margaret's voice was ice. Doors that way. For a moment, Ethan looked like he might push back. Then he smiled, cold and sharp, and walked out. The bell above the door chimed as it closed. Margaret let out a long breath. He's escalating, I noticed. He's going to keep pushing until something breaks. Clara leaned against the counter, suddenly exhausted. I know. The question is what breaks first, him or us? Clara didn't have an answer for that. That night, she and Caleb sat on the porch watching the sun set over the hills. It had become a ritual, this quiet time at the end of brutal days, where they could just exist without having to fight. Ethan came by the bakery again, Clara said. Caleb's expression darkened. What did he want? To remind me I'm ruining your life. He's an idiot. Maybe, but he's an idiot with power. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then, you ever think about what you'd do if you weren't here? Clara looked at him, surprised. What kind of question is that? Just wondering. If you could go anywhere, be anyone, what would you choose? She thought about it, really thought about it. A month ago, the answer would have been simple. Anywhere but here. Anywhere she wasn't judged, wasn't struggling, wasn't fighting just to exist. But now? I'd choose this, she said quietly. Caleb turned to look at her. A failing ranch in the middle of nowhere, being harassed by the town? A place where I matter, where the work I do makes a difference, where someone... She stopped, swallowing hard. Where someone sees me as more than just my limp. His expression softened. I never saw the limp. Not really. Liar. You saw it. You just decided it didn't matter. Same thing. No, it's not. Clara met his eyes. Seeing it and choosing to look past it, that takes effort. That takes deciding someone's worth more than their worst parts. Most people don't bother. Caleb reached over and took her hand. It was a simple gesture, easy to miss, but Clara felt it like a shock through her whole system. You're worth the effort, he said. Clara's throat tightened. She wanted to say something meaningful, something that matched the weight of what he'd just given her. But the words stuck. Instead, she just squeezed his hand back and said, So are you. They sat there as the sun sank below the horizon, hands clasped, neither of them willing to let go first. The next morning, everything changed again. Clara arrived at the bakery to find the front window smashed, glass scattered across the floor inside and out. Margaret was already there, standing in the doorway with a broom, her expression carved from stone. What happened? Clara asked, though she already knew. Someone didn't like the company I keep. There was a rock in the middle of the floor, wrapped in paper. Margaret picked it up and handed it to Clara without comment. The message was short. Send the cripple away or lose more than windows. Clara's hands shook as she read it. Not from fear, from pure, white-hot rage. I'll go, she said. This is exactly what they want. To hurt people until... You'll do no such thing. Margaret took the note back, crumpled it, and threw it into the street. You think this is the first time someone's tried to intimidate me? I've had worse than this. Margaret, no, you listen to me. Margaret's voice was steel. The moment you let bullies win, they never stop. You run now, they'll just find someone else to target. Someone weaker, someone with less fight. Is that what you want? I don't want you to lose your business because of me. Then help me clean this up and get back to work. We've got bread to bake. Clara stared at her, this woman who barely knew her but was willing to risk everything anyway. Why are you doing this? Clara asked, her voice cracking. Margaret's expression softened, just slightly. Because someone did it for me once, and because you remind me of myself. Too stubborn to quit, too proud to beg, and absolutely refusing to believe the world when it tells you you're not good enough. She picked up the broom. Now stop wasting time with questions and start sweeping. We open in an hour. Clara grabbed a broom and got to work. By the time they opened, the glass had been cleared and Margaret had hung a piece of canvas over the broken window. It looked terrible, but it was functional. Customers came in, saw the damage, and whispered. Some looked sympathetic. Others looked satisfied. A few asked what happened, but Margaret just said there'd been an accident and changed the subject. Ethan Rourke came in mid-morning. He looked at the broken window, then at Margaret, then at Clara. His expression was carefully neutral, but Clara saw the satisfaction in his eyes. "Shame about the window," he said. "Hope you have insurance." Margaret didn't look up from the bread she was wrapping. "I'll manage." Still, these things have a way of getting worse if the underlying problem isn't addressed. "The underlying problem," Margaret said slowly, "is that some people in this town have too much time and too little sense." Ethan's smile sharpened. "Interesting theory. I'd argue the problem is people who don't know when to cut their losses. Then it's a good thing nobody asked you." The tension in the room was thick enough to cut. Clara kept working, hands steady, refusing to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. Ethan bought nothing. He just stood there for another minute, making his presence felt, then walked out. The moment the door closed, Margaret let out a breath. "He's going to keep pushing," Clara said. "Let him. He'll find out I push back harder." But that night, when Clara got back to the ranch, she found Caleb in the barn with Tom from the livery. "Can't keep doing this," Tom was saying, his voice low and urgent. "Webb's putting pressure on all of us. Says anyone caught helping you will be cut off too." "So what are you saying?" Caleb asked. Tom looked miserable. "I'm saying I can't supply you anymore. Not without risking my own business." "I'm sorry." Caleb's expression went blank. "I understand. I wish there was another way." "There's not. You've already done more than you had to." Tom nodded, looking relieved to be let off the hook, and left quickly. Clara waited until he was gone before speaking. "How long can we last without his help?" "Maybe a month, if we're careful." "And then?" Caleb didn't answer. They both knew what came after. Without supplies, the ranch would fail. Without the ranch, they had nothing. Clara felt the walls closing in, felt the suffocating weight of inevitability pressing down. But she also felt something else, something hot and fierce and absolutely unwilling to surrender. "We're not done yet," she said. Caleb looked at her. "Clara, Paul? I mean it. They want us to give up? Fine. Let them want. We're going to fight until there's nothing left to fight with." A slow smile spread across Caleb's face. "You're really not going to make this easy on them, are you?" "Not even a little bit." He laughed, tired but genuine. "All right then. What's the plan?" Clara thought about Margaret's broken window, about Tom backing out, about Ethan's smug satisfaction, and she thought about all the times in her life when people had told her to accept her limitations, to know her place, to stop fighting battles she couldn't win. "The plan," she said, "is we stop playing defense and start hitting back." "How?" Clara's mind was already racing. "I don't know yet, but we'll figure it out." They stood there in the barn, surrounded by broken things and impossible odds, and made a silent promise to each other. They weren't giving up. Not now. Not ever. The opportunity came from the last place Clara expected, a stranger passing through town. She was at the bakery 3 days after Tom had backed out, measuring flour with hands that still shook slightly when she thought about how little time they had left. Margaret was in front dealing with the morning rush, and Clara was grateful for the solitude of the back room where she could think. The canvas covering the broken window rippled in the breeze, a constant reminder of how precarious everything had become. "Clara?" Margaret's voice came from the front. "Someone here to see you." Clara wiped her hands and stepped through the doorway. A man stood at the counter, tall, weathered, with the look of someone who spent more time on horseback than on foot. He had the kind of face that was hard to read, lines carved deep by sun and wind. "You're Clara Whitmore?" he asked. "Depends on who's asking." A faint smile crossed his face. "Name's Frank Dalton. I run cattle between here and Prescott. Heard you and Caleb Vance are having some trouble with the local business owners." Clara's guard went up immediately. Where'd you hear that? Word travels on the cattle trails. Ranchers talk. He glanced at Margaret. Mind if I speak with her privately? Margaret looked at Clara, who nodded. They stepped outside into the morning heat. Dalton got straight to the point. I need drovers for the fall run. 20 head of cattle from the Rockingham Ranch north of here down to the railhead in Prescott. It's a week's work, maybe less if the weather holds. Pays $40 per drover. Clara's heart kicked. $40 was more money than she'd make in 2 months at the bakery. Why are you asking me? Because I'm short 3 men, and I heard you're desperate enough to say yes. He said it without judgment, just fact. Also heard you don't quit when things get hard. That's worth something on a drive. I've never worked cattle. Can you ride? Clara hesitated. She'd ridden as a child before the injury. Not well and not recently, but she knew the basics. Some. Can you take orders and not complain? Yes. Then you'll learn the rest. You in or not? It was too easy. There had to be a catch. What about Caleb? What about him? His arm's still healing. He can't do heavy work. Dalton shrugged. Don't need him for heavy work. Need him to ride and keep the herd moving. Rest of the crew handles the rough stuff. He paused. Though I'm guessing you'll hold your own just fine. Clara studied him, trying to figure out the angle. Why are you really doing this? You don't know us. True. But I know what it's like to be shut out by people who think they own a town. And I know that Ethan Rourke is a coward who hides behind other people's money. Dalton's expression hardened. So maybe I'm doing this because it pisses him off. Maybe I'm doing it because I need workers and you need work. Does the reason matter? It didn't. Not really. When do we leave? Clara asked. 4 days. Meet at the Rockingham at dawn. Don't be late. He walked away before Clara could ask anything else. She stood there in the street, dust settling around her boots, and felt something shift in her chest. Not hope exactly. She'd learned to be careful with hope, but possibility. She found Caleb in the south field trying to clear irrigation channels with one good arm and a lot of cursing. He looked up as she approached, wiping sweat from his face. You're back early. We've got a job. Cattle drive to Prescott. Leaves in 4 days. Caleb straightened, wincing as his arm protested. What? Claire explained the conversation with Dalton, watching Caleb's expression shift from confusion to disbelief to cautious optimism. $40 each, he said when she finished. Each. That's enough to buy seed, fix the irrigation, maybe even get a few head of livestock. I know. He looked at her, really looked at her. You've never worked a cattle drive. Neither have you with one arm. That's different. How? Because I know what I'm doing. You'll be learning on the job, which means you'll be working twice as hard just to keep up. He paused. And they're not going to go easy on you because of my leg. You can say it. Caleb's jaw tightened. I just don't want you to get hurt. I've been getting hurt my whole life. At least this time I'm getting paid for it. He looked like he wanted to argue, but Clara cut him off. We're out of options, Caleb. Tom backed out. Margaret can't support us forever. This is our chance to actually make enough money to survive winter. She met his eyes. I'm doing this, with or without you. For a long moment, they just stared at each other. Then Caleb let out a long breath. All right, but we prepare. You need to practice riding, learn how to handle a rope, understand how cattle move. We've got 4 days. Then we better not waste them. The next 4 days were brutal. Caleb found an old saddle in the barn, cracked leather, rusted buckles, but functional, and saddled the ancient mare they'd found in the west pasture. The horse's name was Maggie, and she had the personality of a particularly grumpy grandmother. She's perfect for learning, Caleb said, helping Clara mount. She's too old and too tired to do anything stupid. Maggie immediately tried to bite Clara's foot. You were saying? Clara asked, pulling her leg out of range. Caleb bit back a smile. Like I said, perfect. Riding was harder than Clara remembered. Her hip protested every movement, the saddle rubbed her legs raw, and Maggie seemed to take personal offense at being asked to do anything faster than a walk. But Clara gritted her teeth and kept at it. Caleb worked her relentlessly. Up at dawn, in the saddle by the time the sun cleared the hills, he taught her how to sit properly, how to use her legs to guide instead of just reins. how to read an animal's body language. When she fell, and she fell 3 times that first day, he made her get back up immediately. "Cattle don't wait for you to feel ready," he said, offering his good hand to help her up. "You fall, you get up. Simple as that." By the second day, Clara could stay mounted at a trot. By the third, she could handle a basic rope without strangling herself. By the fourth, she was exhausted, bruised, and absolutely determined to prove she could do this. Margaret gave her the 4 days off from the bakery, though Clara suspected she couldn't really afford it. "Go," Margaret said when Clara tried to protest. "Make that money, then come back and tell me how Ethan Rourke's face looked when he found out." The morning they left for the Rocking M Ranch, Clara woke before dawn with her stomach in knots. She dressed in the most practical clothes she had, men's trousers she'd altered to fit, a worn shirt, boots that were holding together through sheer stubbornness. Her whole body ached from the practice sessions, but she ignored it. Caleb was already up, checking the wagon and loading supplies. His arm was still bandaged, but he moved with more confidence than he had in weeks. "You ready?" he asked. Clara thought about lying, but didn't. "No, but I'm going anyway." He smiled. "That's the spirit." They rode out together in the pre-dawn darkness, the wagon creaking beneath them, heading north toward the Rocking M. The ranch was a 2-hour ride, and they made it in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The Rocking M was bigger than Caleb's place. Proper corrals, a bunkhouse, a main house that actually looked maintained. Cattle milled in the pens, more than Clara had ever seen in one place. The noise was overwhelming, lowing, hoofbeats, men shouting instructions. Dalton was waiting near the main corral. He nodded when he saw them. "You made it. Good." He gestured toward a group of men preparing horses. "That's the crew. Get yourselves sorted, and we leave in 30 minutes. The crew was exactly what Clara had expected. Rough men who'd spent their lives working cattle, all of them looking at her with varying degrees of skepticism and amusement. One of them, a stocky man with a scar across his cheek, actually laughed when he saw her. "That's one of your drovers? A crippled girl?" Dalton's expression went cold. "That's Clara Whitmore. She can ride and she doesn't quit. Which is more than I can say for the last man you recommended, who ran off halfway through the drive with half our supplies." The man's face flushed, but he shut up. Another drover, older, with gray in his beard, stepped forward. "Name's Charlie. I'll be riding point. You'll be in the middle of the herd with the newer hands, keeping stragglers moving. Stay alert, don't get in the way, and you'll be fine." Clara nodded, throat too tight to speak. They mounted up. Clara's hand shook as she swung into the saddle, but once she was seated, muscle memory took over. Maggie shifted beneath her, testing, then settled. Dalton gave the signal, and the herd started moving. The first day was chaos. Cattle were nothing like the docile creatures Clara had imagined. They were massive, unpredictable, and seemed determined to go in every direction except forward. Her job was to keep the ones at the edges from breaking away, which meant constant riding, constant vigilance, constant pressure on animals that outweighed her 10 times over. Her hips screamed, her legs cramped. Dust got in her eyes, her mouth, her lungs. She didn't stop. When a steer broke from the herd, she went after it, pushing Maggie harder than she'd ever dared. The old mare responded, cutting off the steer's escape route, forcing it back toward the group. Clara whooped, surprising herself, and heard one of the other drovers laugh. "Looks like she's got some fire," Charlie called. By the time they stopped for the night, Clara could barely dismount. Her whole body was one massive bruise. But she'd kept up. She'd done her job. Caleb found her as she was trying to unsaddle Maggie, her hands too stiff to work the buckles. "Here." He did it one-handed, his movements practiced. "How you holding up?" "I hurt in places I didn't know I had." "That means you're doing it right." She leaned against Maggie's side, too tired to stand on her own. "How's your arm?" "Sore, but functional." He glanced at her. "You did good today. I fell behind twice, and caught up both times. That's what matters." The crew ate around a fire, beans and hardtack and coffee that tasted like it had been boiled with rocks. Clara forced herself to eat, knowing she'd need the energy tomorrow. The man with the scar, his name was Reed, she'd learned, sat across the fire, still watching her with open skepticism. "So how'd a cripple end up working cattle?" he asked, his tone just friendly enough to have deniability. The fire went quiet. Everyone was listening now. Clara met his eyes. Same way anyone ends up here. Needed work, got offered a job, showed up. But you can't even walk right. How are you going to handle a stampede? Same way you would, by staying in the saddle and doing my job. That's assuming you can stay in the saddle. Caleb started to stand, but Clara put a hand on his arm, stopping him. I've stayed in the saddle all day, she said evenly. I'll stay in it tomorrow too, and the day after that, however long this takes. Reed leaned back, studying her. Then he nodded slowly. We'll see. It wasn't acceptance, but it wasn't open hostility either. Clara would take it. The second day was harder than the first. Everything hurt. Every muscle. Clara had screamed in protest when she mounted up. Her hip felt like someone had taken a hammer to it. The blisters on her hands had blistered on top of blisters, but the herd had to keep moving. They crossed rougher terrain, rocky hills, dry creek beds, patches of scrub that the cattle tried to stop and graze on. Clara learned to read the herd's mood, to spot which animals were troublemakers, to anticipate breaks before they happened. She also learned that cattle were idiots. They'll walk off a cliff if you let them, Charlie told her during a brief rest. No survival instinct whatsoever. That's why they need us. Lucky them, Clara muttered, and Charlie laughed. By midday, her vision was starting to blur from exhaustion and pain. She almost missed it when a calf got separated from its mother, wandering toward a ravine. Almost. Clara urged Maggie forward, cutting between the calf and the drop. The calf bawled, panicking, and tried to bolt. Clara leaned into the turn, using her weight to guide Maggie, and managed to herd the calf back toward the herd. When she looked up, Reed was watching. He gave her a small nod, barely perceptible, but there. Progress. That night, Clara collapsed onto her bedroll without even eating. Caleb brought her food anyway, made her drink water, checked that she wasn't injured beyond the normal wear. You're doing better than half the crew, he said quietly. Liar. I'm serious. Reed's impressed, and he's never impressed by anyone. Clara cracked one eye open. He thinks I'm going to fail. He thought you'd fail yesterday. Now he thinks you might last the week. That's improvement. She wanted to respond, but exhaustion dragged her under before she could form words. The third day brought the first real test, a river crossing. The water was running fast from mountain runoff, deeper than it looked, with rocks hidden beneath the surface. The cattle balked at the edge, refusing to enter. We need to get them moving before they panic, Dalton called. Charlie, take point. Rest of you, push from behind. Clara positioned Maggie at the rear of the herd, her heart hammering. The cattle were nervous, shifting and lowing. One wrong move and they'd scatter. Charlie rode into the water first, showing the herd it was safe. Slowly, reluctantly, the first few cattle followed. Then one slipped. It went down hard, thrashing in the current, and the rest of the herd panicked. Cattle tried to turn back, climbing over each other, chaos spreading like wildfire. Hold them, Dalton shouted. Don't let them break. Clara pushed Maggie forward, shouting, using her rope to turn the cattle back toward the water. Other drovers were doing the same, a wall of horses and noise forcing the herd to move. The cattle that had fallen managed to get its footing and lunge forward. The others, seeing it survive, started moving again. Slowly, painfully, they got the herd across. Clara was soaked to the skin, shaking from adrenaline, but they'd done it. Reed rode up beside her as they regrouped on the far bank. Not bad, Whitmore. It was the first time he'd used her name. Thanks, Clara managed. He rode off without another word, but she saw the faint smile on his face. That night, the crew treated her differently. Not like an equal, not yet, but not like dead weight either. They included her in conversations, asked her opinion on the herd's condition, made room for her at the fire without it being a statement. It felt like victory, small and hard won. Caleb found her after dinner, his expression proud. You're winning them over. I'm surviving. That's different. No, it's not. He sat down beside her. These men don't give respect easy. You've earned it. Clara looked at the fire, at the crew scattered around it, and felt something shift in her chest. For the first time since arriving in Arizona, she felt like she might actually belong somewhere. The fourth day brought them within sight of Prescott. The town was bigger than Ashford, real buildings, paved streets, the railhead visible in the distance. Clara felt a mix of relief and anxiety. They were almost done, almost paid, almost able to save the ranch. They penned the cattle in the holding yards near the rail station. Dalton negotiated with the buyer, a brisk transaction that took less than 10 minutes. Then he paid the crew. When he handed Clara her $40, actual cash, more money than she'd ever held at Warren once, she had to fight back tears. "You earned it," Dalton said. "Hell of a job for your first drive." "Thank you," he nodded. "You ever want work again? You let me know. I can always use good people." The crew dispersed into town, heading for saloons and stores and whatever else men did when they finally got paid. Clara and Caleb stood in the street, looking at each other. "We did it," Clara said. "Yeah, we did." They should have been celebrating, should have been riding home immediately to start spending the money on everything the ranch needed. Instead, Caleb said, "Let's stay the night, get proper rest before we head back." Clara wanted to argue. Every day away from the ranch felt like tempting fate, but she was exhausted down to her bones, and the idea of sleeping in an actual bed was too tempting to resist. All right, one night, they found a modest boarding house, nothing fancy but clean and safe. Clara got her own room, a luxury she hadn't had in months. She locked the door, collapsed onto the bed, and didn't move for 12 hours. When she woke, it was late morning. Sunlight streamed through the window, warm and gentle. For the first time in recent memory, nothing hurt, or at least nothing hurt urgently. She washed, changed into her least dirty clothes, and went downstairs to find Caleb waiting. "Thought you were going to sleep forever," he said. "Considered it." They ate breakfast in a small restaurant, real eggs, real bread, coffee that didn't taste like punishment. It felt absurdly decadent. "What do we buy first?" Clara asked. Caleb pulled out a piece of paper where he'd been making notes. "Seed for the garden, wire for the fences, nails, lumber if we can afford it. Maybe a few chickens to add to the flock." Clara listened to the list, practical and necessary, and felt something warm settle in her chest. They were planning, not just surviving, but actually building something. "We should get you new boots too," Caleb added. "Those are falling apart." Clara looked down at her boots, which were indeed held together mostly by hope and stubbornness. The ranch needs you to have functional footwear. Non-negotiable." She smiled. "Fine. New boots?" They spent the afternoon shopping, carefully counting out money for each purchase. It should have been boring, but Clara found herself enjoying it. The simple act of buying things they needed, of making decisions together about their future. Their future. When had she started thinking of it that way? They were loading the wagon when Clara saw him. Ethan Rourke standing across the street with two other men staring directly at her. Her stomach dropped. "Caleb," she said quietly. He looked up, followed her gaze, and his expression hardened. Ethan crossed the street, his companions flanking him. "Well," Ethan said, his voice carrying. "Look who's in Prescott. The cripple and her pet rancher." People on the street stopped to watch. Clara felt the familiar weight of attention, of judgment. "Walk away, Rourke," Caleb said. "This is a free country. I'll walk where I please." Ethan's eyes flicked to the loaded wagon. "Looks like you came into some money. Rob someone?" "We worked for it. You should try it sometime." Ethan's smile went sharp. "I work plenty, building connections, maintaining relationships, investing in the community. Things you'd understand if you weren't so busy sheltering someone who doesn't belong here." Clara stepped forward before Caleb could respond. "If I don't belong, why do you care so much about what I do?" Ethan's attention snapped to her. "Because you're a stain on this territory. A reminder that some people don't know their place. My place is wherever I choose to stand. That bothering you?" His expression darkened. "You think working one cattle drive makes you special? You're still a crippled girl who'll never be worth the trouble she causes." The words should have hurt. A month ago, they would have devastated her. Now, Clara just felt tired. "You know what's funny?" she said. "I've spent my whole life being told I'm not good enough. By my family, by strangers, by you. And I used to believe it." She met his eyes. "But I just spent 4 days working harder than you've ever worked in your life. I saved a man's life. I rebuilt a ranch. I earned respect from people who had every reason to dismiss me. So when you say I'm not worth the trouble," she smiled, "I know you're wrong." Ethan's face flushed red. "You think you've won something? Your ranch is still failing. The town still hates you. Nothing's changed." Everything's changed, Caleb said quietly. We've changed, and that's something you'll never understand. For a moment, Ethan looked like he might actually hit someone. His fists clenched, his whole body rigid with barely controlled rage. Then one of his companions put a hand on his arm. Let's go. She's not worth it. Ethan shook him off but stepped back. This isn't over. Yeah, it is, Clara said. You just don't know it yet. Ethan and his men walked away and the crowd that had gathered slowly dispersed. Clara's hands were shaking, but she felt strangely calm, like something inside her had finally settled into place. Caleb touched her shoulder. You all right? Yeah, I really am. They finished loading the wagon and left Prescott as the sun was setting, heading home with money in their pockets and supplies in the back. The ranch looked different when they arrived, or maybe Clara was seeing it differently. It was still rough, still half broken, still surrounded by challenges, but it was theirs. They unloaded in silence, both too tired for conversation. But as Clara carried the last sack of seed into the barn, Caleb caught her arm. Clara. She turned. Thank you, he said, for not giving up. On the ranch. On me. On any of it. Clara's throat tightened. You did the same for me. Not the same. You saved my life. I just gave you a job. You gave me a chance. That's worth more than you think. They stood there in the barn, surrounded by supplies that represented a future they'd fought for, and Clara realized something. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was living. The money from the cattle drive changed things, but not in the ways Clara had expected. They bought seed and wire and lumber, just like they'd planned. They fixed the irrigation channels, patched more of the barn, reinforced the chicken coop until it could withstand anything short of a tornado. The ranch slowly stopped looking like it was dying and started looking like it might actually survive. But the town's hostility didn't fade. If anything, it intensified. Webb at the general store still refused them service. Mrs. Callahan still sneered when Clara walked past, and Ethan Rourke still made it his personal mission to remind everyone in Ashford that Clara Whitmore was a problem that needed solving. 2 weeks after they returned from Prescott, Clara arrived at the bakery to find Margaret waiting with a grim expression. They're pushing harder, Margaret said without preamble. Webb came by yesterday. Said if I keep employing you, he'll convince the grain supplier to cut me off. Clara felt her stomach drop. Can he do that? He can try. The supplier's his brother-in-law, so probably yes. Margaret's jaw was tight. I told him where he could shove his threats, but I wanted you to know what we're dealing with. You should let me go. Not a chance. Margaret, I said no. I've survived worse than Webb and his cronies. But there was strain in Margaret's voice, a weariness that hadn't been there before. Clara worked her shift in silence, mixing dough and cleaning pans while her mind raced. Every door they opened, someone tried to slam shut. Every small victory was met with a new obstacle. She was tired of fighting, tired of being the reason good people suffered. That evening, she sat on the porch watching the sun set and seriously considered leaving. Not running away exactly, just removing herself from the equation. If she went back east, found work somewhere else, maybe Caleb could rebuild his relationships with the town. Maybe Margaret could keep her bakery. Maybe everyone would be better off. Caleb found her there an hour later, her face wet with tears she hadn't realized she was crying. Hey. He sat down beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. What's wrong? Everything, nothing. I don't know anymore. That's specific. Despite herself, Clara laughed, a broken, soggy sound. They're threatening Margaret now, because of me, and Webb, and Ethan, and this whole damn town. They're never going to stop. We can work ourselves to death and it won't matter because they've decided I don't belong here. Caleb was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, You're right. Clara looked at him, surprised. They're never going to accept you, he continued. At least not the way you want. People like Ethan and Webb, they need someone to look down on. Makes them feel important. And you refusing to disappear, refusing to act ashamed, that threatens them. So what do I do? You stop trying to make them accept you and start making them respect you instead. How? Caleb's expression shifted into something harder, more determined. We go public. We stop hiding, stop playing defense, and we make them confront what they've been doing. Clara's heart started beating faster. What are you talking about? The town meeting. It's this Saturday. Anyone can speak. We show up, we lay out everything, how they've been freezing us out, threatening our suppliers, trying to starve us into submission. We make them defend their actions in front of everyone. They'll never let us speak. They have to. It's the rules. And if they try to shut us down, that proves our point. Clara thought about it. The idea was terrifying and appealing in equal measure. Stop hiding. Stop apologizing. Make them see her. They could make things worse, she said. They're already as bad as they can get without actually running us out of town. Might as well fight back. Clara looked at him. At this man who'd been half dead when she found him, who'd given her a chance when no one else would, who'd stood beside her through everything. All right, she said. Let's do it. The next few days were a blur of preparation. Caleb wrote everything down: dates, names, specific incidents, the feed store cutting off credit, Webb's ultimatum, the broken window at the bakery, Ethan's public harassment, every petty cruelty, every calculated move to force them out. Margaret contributed her own experiences, things Clara hadn't even known about, threats from other business owners, pressure from the church council, whispered suggestions that maybe she'd be happier somewhere else. Sarah from the boarding house added her voice too, quietly, afraid but determined. She'd been helping them in small ways and had faced her own consequences, guests canceling reservations, rumors spreading about the quality of her rooms. By Friday night, they had a complete picture of systematic harassment spanning weeks. This is enough, Caleb said, looking at the pages of notes. This is undeniable. You're assuming they'll care about evidence, Clara said. They will when it's laid out in front of the whole town, when they have to own what they've been doing. Clara wanted to believe him, but she'd learned the hard way that evidence and truth didn't always matter when people had already made up their minds. Still, they were committed now. Saturday morning dawned clear and hot. Clara dressed carefully, the cleanest clothes she owned, her hair pinned back, boots that Caleb had insisted on buying her in Prescott. She wanted to look respectable, wanted to look like she belonged. They rode into town together, the wagon creaking beneath them. Clara's stomach was in knots, her hands shaking slightly on the reins. Beside her, Caleb was solid and calm, but she could see the tension in his shoulders. The town meeting was held in the church, the only building large enough to hold everyone. By the time Clara and Caleb arrived, it was already half full. People turned to stare as they entered, whispers spreading like wildfire. Ethan Rourke was there, sitting in the front row with Webb and several other prominent business owners. His expression when he saw Clara was pure contempt. Margaret was there too, sitting in the back with Sarah and Tom from the livery. They nodded at Clara, small gestures of support that felt enormous. The meeting started with routine business, water rights disputes, discussion of road maintenance, complaints about livestock wandering into town. Clara barely heard any of it. Her heart was pounding so hard she thought everyone must be able to hear it. Finally, the moderator, a thin man named Porter who owned the land office, asked if anyone had additional business. Caleb stood. The room went silent. "I have something to say," Caleb announced, his voice carrying clearly, "about how this town treats people it doesn't want." Porter's expression tightened. "Mr. Vance, if you're going to make accusations, I'm going to present facts. You can decide what they mean." Caleb walked to the front of the room. Clara followed, her limp more pronounced than usual from nerves. She felt every eye on her, felt the weight of judgment and curiosity and hostility. Caleb began laying out their case. He spoke clearly, methodically, citing specific dates and incidents, the denial of credit, the threats against Margaret, the broken window, Ethan's public harassment. The room listened in uncomfortable silence. When Caleb mentioned Ethan's name, the man himself stood up. "This is absurd. I've never threatened anyone." "You told me in Prescott that Clara was a stain on this territory," Caleb said evenly, "in front of witnesses. That's not a threat. That's an opinion. An opinion you've used to pressure others into cutting us off." Ethan's face flushed. "I've done no such thing. If people choose not to do business with you, that's their right." "It is. But organizing a coordinated campaign to force someone out through economic pressure is something else entirely." Webb stood now, his expression defensive. "Nobody's forcing anything. We're protecting our businesses from bad associations." "What bad association?" Clara asked, her voice cutting through the room. What exactly have I done that's so terrible? The question hung in the air. Webb stammered, You've been disruptive. How? By working? By surviving? By not disappearing when you wanted me to? You're not fit for this life. You can barely walk. And yet I worked a cattle drive to Prescott. Asked the crew if I pulled my weight. Reed was there. Clara hadn't noticed him before. Sitting in the middle section. He stood slowly. She did more than pull her weight, Reed said, his gravelly voice carrying authority. Worked harder than men twice her size. Didn't complain once. If that's not fit for this life, I don't know what is. Ethan turned on him. You don't know what you're talking about. I know exactly what I'm talking about. I've worked cattle for 20 years. That girl earned her pay, and then some. The room was shifting now. Claire could feel it, people reconsidering, reassessing. Not everyone, but some. Mrs. Callahan stood, her expression pinched. This isn't about her work ethic. It's about standards, about maintaining the quality of people we allow in our community. Quality? Margaret's voice cut like a knife as she stood. You want to talk about quality? Clara works harder than anyone I know. She's honest, reliable, and she doesn't judge people for things they can't control. Meanwhile, you run a boarding house where you refuse service to anyone who doesn't meet your narrow definition of acceptable. Who's really failing the community here? How dare you? I dare because I'm tired of watching good people get crushed by small-minded hypocrites. The room erupted in arguments, people shouting over each other. Porter tried to restore order, banging his gavel, but the chaos had taken hold. Then Caleb's voice cut through everything. Enough. The room went quiet. Caleb stood at the front, his bandaged arm hanging at his side, his expression fierce. You want to know why I'm defending her? He asked. Fine, I'll tell you. When I was dying from infection, when I'd given up on everything, she walked 5 miles in the desert heat to reach my ranch. She had no money, no supplies, no reason to care whether I lived or died. But she did it anyway. She cut infection out of my arm with a dull razor and whiskey. She held me down when the fever made me violent. She worked herself to exhaustion, keeping me alive because that's who she is. His voice dropped, but lost none of its intensity. This woman saved my life. Then she rebuilt my ranch from nothing. She's worked herself bloody trying to prove she deserves to exist in your precious community. And what have you done? You've mocked her, threatened her, tried to starve her out. You've punished good people for showing her basic human kindness. He looked around the room, meeting eyes. So, here's the truth you don't want to hear. Clara Whitmore is worth 10 of most of you. She's tougher, more dedicated, and more honest than people who've lived here their whole lives. And if you can't see that, if you're so blinded by your prejudices that you'd rather destroy someone than admit you were wrong, then this community deserves to fail. The silence was absolute. Claire's eyes were burning, her throat tight. She'd never heard anyone defend her like that. Never heard anyone say she was worth something without qualification or hesitation. Ethan was the first to speak, his voice shaking with rage. You're a fool, Vance. She's made you soft, weak. You're throwing away everything for a crippled girl who'll never... Caleb moved fast, crossing the distance between them before anyone could react. He didn't hit Ethan, didn't touch him, but he got close enough that Ethan actually flinched back. Finish that sentence, Caleb said quietly. I dare you. Ethan's mouth worked, but no sound came out. That's what I thought. Caleb stepped back. Claire's not the problem here. Your cowardice is. Your desperate need to feel superior to someone. She threatens that, so you want her gone. But she's not going anywhere, neither am I. So you're going to have to figure out how to live with that. He turned to Clara. Come on. We're done here. They walked out together, through the stunned silence, into the bright afternoon sun. Clara didn't speak until they were in the wagon, heading out of town. Then she said, her voice shaking, That was either the bravest thing I've ever seen or the stupidest. Probably both. They're going to make things worse. Let them try. We've got money. We've got supplies. We've got people willing to help us. They can't actually force us out unless we let them. Clara looked at him, at this man who'd just burned every bridge he had left in Ashford for her sake. Why did you do that? She asked. Because it was true. And because you deserved to hear someone say it. Her throat was too tight to respond. They rode in silence for a while. Then Caleb said, There's something else I need to tell you. Clara's stomach clenched. What? He pulled the wagon to a stop at the side of the road, turning to face her fully. When you first got here, I was ready to die. Not just from the infection, from everything. I'd lost my wife 2 years ago, lost most of my livestock the year after that. The ranch was failing, I was failing, and it just seemed easier to give up. Clara hadn't known about his wife, hadn't known about any of it. Then you showed up, Caleb continued, this stubborn, half-dead woman who refused to quit even when any sane person would have. And you made me want to fight again, not just for the ranch, for something more. Caleb, let me finish. He took a breath. I know this isn't fair. I know you've got your own struggles, your own life to figure out. But I need you to know. He paused, choosing words carefully. You're not just my employee. You're not just someone I'm helping out of obligation. You're my partner in every way that matters. Clara's heart was hammering. What are you saying? I'm saying I want you to stay. Not because the ranch needs you, though it does. Not because I owe you, though I do. But because I can't imagine doing any of this without you. He met her eyes. I'm saying I care about you, Clara. More than I should, probably. More than I plan to. The words hung between them, vulnerable and raw. Clara's mind was racing. This wasn't what she'd expected, wasn't what she'd planned for. She'd come here for safety, for survival, not for this, whatever this was. I don't know what to say, she admitted. You don't have to say anything. I just needed you to know. But Clara did have to say something, because sitting here, looking at Caleb, she realized something she'd been avoiding for weeks. She didn't want to leave, didn't want to go back east, didn't want to start over somewhere else. Despite everything, the hostility, the struggle, the constant uphill battle, this place felt more like home than anywhere she'd ever been. And Caleb felt like home too. I'm scared, she said quietly. Of what? Of this. Of caring about someone who could change their mind, who could wake up one day and realize I'm more trouble than I'm worth. Her voice cracked. Everyone else has. Caleb reached over and took her hand. His palm was calloused, warm, solid. I'm not everyone else, and I'm not changing my mind. You can't know that. Yes, I can. Because I've seen you at your worst, exhausted, hurting, covered in blood from saving my life. And I still thought you were the most remarkable person I'd ever met. It's not going to get worse than that. Clara laughed despite herself, the sound watery. That's a low bar. It's an honest one. She looked at their joined hands, at the evidence of work and struggle written in scars and calluses. Nothing about this was perfect. Nothing about them was easy. But it was real. I want to stay, Clara said. Not as an employee, as... She struggled for the right word. As whatever this is, whatever we're building. Caleb's smile was slow and genuine. We can figure out what to call it later. Deal. He squeezed her hand, then released it to take up the reins again. As they started moving, Clara felt something settle in her chest. Not quite peace, but close. Acceptance, maybe. Or just the absence of the constant fear that had been her companion for so long. The road back to the ranch had never felt shorter. Over the next few weeks, things shifted in ways Clara couldn't have predicted. The town didn't suddenly embrace her. That would have been too much to hope for. But the open hostility faded into something more like grudging tolerance. People still stared, but fewer of them sneered. The general store still wouldn't serve them directly, but they stopped actively sabotaging supply runs. And some people, not many but some, actually apologized. Sarah from the boarding house was first, catching Claire outside the bakery one morning. I should have spoken up sooner, Sarah said, her voice quiet. Should have defended you in that meeting instead of waiting for others to do it. I'm sorry. Claire didn't know what to say. You helped us. That's more than most people did. Helping in secret isn't the same as standing up publicly. I know that now. Tom from the livery made a similar confession, offering to resume supply runs at no extra charge. A few other business owners followed suit, quietly, without fanfare, but meaningfully. The town was changing. Slowly, imperfectly, but changing. Margaret noticed it too. You've shifted something, she told Clara one afternoon at the bakery. Made them uncomfortable with their own behavior. That's powerful. Doesn't feel powerful, feels exhausting. Most worthwhile things are. The ranch prospered in small ways. The garden they'd planted began producing tomatoes, beans, squash. Not enough to sell, but enough to eat. The chickens multiplied until they had a proper flock. They bought 2 young cattle with the last of the money from the drive, a start toward rebuilding the herd. And Clara and Caleb figured out what they were to each other. It wasn't romance in the traditional sense. No grand gestures or passionate declarations. It was quieter than that. Hands touching while working side by side. Caleb making sure Clara had the easier tasks when her hip was bad. Clara staying up late to rewrap his arm bandages even after it had mostly healed. Small kindnesses that added up to something solid. One evening, about a month after the town meeting, they were sitting on the porch watching the sunset when Caleb said, "I was thinking we should expand the house." Clara looked at him. "Why?" "Because if you're staying permanently, you should have a real room, not just sleeping by the fireplace." "I don't mind." "I mind. You deserve better." Clara felt warmth spread through her chest. "A room would be nice. We could build it on the east side, get morning light. We'd need more lumber. We'll manage." They sat in comfortable silence, planning a future that a few months ago would have been unimaginable. Then Caleb said, casual but careful, "There's another option." "What's that?" "We could just share a room, properly, as—" He paused, searching for words. "As people who've decided they're in this together." Clara's heart jumped. "You mean get married?" "Eventually, maybe, if you want. But I meant more." He looked at her. "I meant stop pretending we're just business partners when we're clearly more than that." Clara had spent her whole life being told she wasn't enough for anyone to want permanently, that her limp, her limitations, her very existence made her unmarriageable. The idea that someone would actively choose her, not despite her flaws, but with full knowledge of them, was staggering. "I want that," she said quietly, "but I'm still scared." "Of what?" "Of you realizing you made a mistake, of waking up and regretting this." Caleb reached over and took her hand. "Clara, I regret a lot of things in my life. Waiting too long to fix the barn, not saving more money when times were good, being stubborn when my wife tried to get me to see a doctor." His grip tightened. "But you? Never. Not once. Not even on the hardest days." Clara's eyes burned. "How can you be sure?" "Because I know what my life was before you came. Empty, dying, going through motions because I didn't have the courage to actually quit. And I know what it is now. Hard, yes, but worth it. Worth fighting for." He paused. "You made me remember why any of this matters." Clara couldn't speak past the lump in her throat. She just nodded and leaned into him, feeling his arm come around her shoulders. They stayed like that until the stars came out, neither of them wanting to move, neither of them needing to say anything more. The confrontation with Ethan came 3 weeks later when Clara least expected it. She was at the bakery, alone in the back room preparing dough for the next day, when she heard the front door open. Margaret was out making deliveries, so Clara wiped her hands and went to greet the customer. Ethan Rourke stood in the middle of the shop, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. Clara's guard went up immediately. "Margaret's not here." "I know, I saw her leave." He shifted uncomfortably. "I came to talk to you." "About what?" "About—" He stopped, clearly struggling. "About being wrong." Clara stared at him. "What?" "I was wrong, about you, about a lot of things." The words came out stiff, like he was pulling teeth. "What I said at the town meeting, what I did, it was wrong." Clara didn't move. "Is this some kind of trick?" "No, it's—" He took a breath. "My mother came to visit last week, heard about what happened, tore into me for an hour about how I'd become exactly the kind of man she raised me not to be." He looked at the floor. "She was right." "So you're apologizing because your mother made you?" "I'm apologizing because I realized something. When I rejected you at the station, I thought I was being practical, thought I was making a smart decision based on what I needed." He finally met her eyes. "But I was just being cruel. And then I kept being cruel because admitting I was wrong felt worse than doubling down." Clara's chest was tight. She'd imagined this conversation 100 times, what she'd say, how she'd make him hurt the way he'd hurt her. But now that it was happening, she just felt tired. Why are you telling me this? Because you deserve to hear it. And because watching what you've accomplished, rebuilding that ranch, earning respect from people who had every reason to dismiss you, standing up in that meeting, he shook his head. You would have made a terrible rancher's wife for me, but that's because I would have wasted everything you are. Caleb sees it. The town's starting to see it. I was the only one too stubborn to admit it. Clara leaned against the counter, processing. This wasn't what she'd wanted. Vindication felt hollow when it came too late. I don't forgive you, she said finally. Ethan nodded. I don't expect you to. I just wanted you to know that the problem was never you. It was always me. He turned to leave, then stopped at the door. For what it's worth, Caleb's lucky to have you. I hope he knows that. He does. Ethan nodded once more and left. Clara stood in the empty bakery, feeling something release inside her chest. Not forgiveness. She wasn't ready for that. Might never be. But the sharp edge of anger that had lived in her since that day at the train station finally dulled. She went back to work, and when Margaret returned an hour later, Clara told her what had happened. Margaret listened, then said, How do you feel? Weird, like I should feel something bigger than I do. Sometimes closure just feels like relief that the noise finally stopped. Is that what this is? Only you can answer that. Clara thought about it while she finished her shift, thought about it during the ride home, thought about it while she and Caleb made dinner together, moving around each other in the small kitchen like they'd been doing it for years. Finally, as they sat down to eat, she said, Ethan apologized today. Caleb's fork paused halfway to his mouth. He did what? Claire explained the conversation. Caleb listened, his expression unreadable. How do you feel about it? He asked when she finished. Like maybe I can stop thinking about him. Stop letting him take up space in my head. That's probably the best outcome. Yeah, Clara picked at her food. I kept waiting for some big moment of victory, some dramatic confrontation where I proved he was wrong and I was right. But this just feels over? Yeah. Caleb reached across the table and took her hand. Over's good. Over means we can focus on what comes next instead of what came before. Clara squeezed his fingers, feeling the truth of it. The past would always be there, the rejection, the struggle, the pain, but it didn't have to define everything. So what does come next? She asked. Caleb smiled. That room expansion, for starters. Then we need to think about spring planting. And I was talking to Dalton about another cattle drive in the fall. He specifically asked if you'd be interested. Really? Said you were the best drover he'd had in years. Wants to hire you regular. Clara felt a swell of pride. I'd like that. They finished dinner and cleaned up together, talking about plans and possibilities and all the mundane details of building a life. Later, as Clara was getting ready for bed, in her space by the fireplace, though that would change soon with the room expansion, Caleb stopped her. I got you something. He pulled out a small wooden box, worn smooth with age. What is it? Open it. Inside was a ring. Simple, silver, with a small stone that caught the firelight. Clara's breath stopped. It was my mother's, Caleb said. She gave it to my wife when we married. After she died, I put it away, thought I'd never use it again. He took it out of the box. But then you came along and made me realize I had more life left to live. Caleb, I know we said we'd figure things out as we went, but I'm tired of being vague about this. I want to marry you, Clara. Not because it's practical, not because the ranch needs it, but because I love you. Because I want to spend whatever time I have left making sure you know you're valued and wanted, and enough exactly as you are. Clara's vision blurred with tears. I don't know if I'm good at this, at being someone's anything. You're already good at it. You've been my partner for months. This just makes it official. Clara looked at the ring, then at Caleb, then back at the ring. Every instinct she had screamed warnings that this was too good to be true, that something would go wrong, that she'd mess it up somehow. But there was another voice too, quieter but steadier. The voice that had kept her walking 5 miles in the desert, that had made her cut infection from a dying man's arm, that had pushed her through cattle drives and town meetings and every impossible thing she'd done since arriving in Arizona. That voice said, You deserve this. Yes, Clara said. Yes, I'll marry you. Caleb's smile was brighter than she'd ever seen it. He He slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, like it had been waiting for her, and pulled her into a kiss that was gentle and fierce and full of promise. When they finally pulled apart, Clara laughed through her tears. "What?" Caleb asked. "I just realized I came here expecting to marry a man who didn't want me, and I'm leaving engaged to one who does. Poetic justice. Something like that." They stood there in the firelight, holding each other, and Clara felt something she'd never felt before. She felt like she'd finally come home. The wedding was small, held on the ranch with just the people who mattered. Margaret stood up with Clara, wearing her best dress and looking fiercely proud. Tom and Sarah came, along with Reed and a few of the other drovers from the cattle drive. Dalton showed up with a bottle of whiskey and a genuine smile. Conspicuously absent were Ethan, Webb, Mrs. Callahan, and most of Ashford's prominent citizens. Clara didn't care. She'd stopped needing their approval the moment she'd realized she had something better. Respect, earned through her own efforts. The ceremony itself was simple. No fancy words, no elaborate promises. Just Clara and Caleb standing on the porch of the house they'd rebuilt together, promising to keep choosing each other. When it was over, Margaret hugged Clara so tight she could barely breathe. "You did it," Margaret whispered. "You survived and found something worth staying for." "We both did," Clara said, because Margaret had fought her own battles to get here. The celebration lasted into the evening. Food that everyone had contributed, music from Tom's fiddle, stories and laughter, and the kind of easy companionship that came from shared struggle. As the sun set, Clara found herself standing at the edge of the porch, looking out over the ranch. The fields were green with growing crops. The barn stood solid against the sky. The chicken coop was full of noise and life. It wasn't perfect, would probably never be perfect, but it was theirs. Caleb came up beside her, slipping an arm around her waist. "Thinking?" he asked, "about how different everything is from when I got here. Better or worse?" "Better. Harder, but better." He pulled her closer. "You know what the best part is?" "What?" "We get to keep building it. Every day we get to decide what this place becomes." Clara leaned into him, feeling the solid warmth of his presence. "I like the sound of that." They stood there as their friends laughed and celebrated behind them, as the stars came out overhead, as the future stretched ahead full of possibility and work, and the kind of love that came from choosing each other every day. Clara Whitmore had arrived in Arizona broken, rejected, with nothing but a bundle of belongings and a desperate hope for something better. She was leaving that life behind as Clara Vance, whole, not despite her scars, but because of them, valued not for being perfect, but for being real. Home, not because someone had granted her permission to stay, but because she'd fought for a place that was hers. The ranch still needed work. The town would probably always have people who looked at her with judgment. Life would throw more challenges at them, more obstacles to overcome. But Clara wasn't afraid anymore, because she'd learned something essential on that brutal journey from the train station to this porch, that belonging wasn't something you were given. It was something you built piece by piece, day by day, with your own scarred hands and stubborn heart. And she'd built something that would last. As the party wound down and guests began heading home, as Caleb pulled her inside toward their newly expanded bedroom, as Clara took one last look at the land that had tested and changed and ultimately accepted her, she felt something settle deep in her bones. Peace, hard-won and precious and entirely her own. She'd survived. More than that, she'd found a place where she didn't just exist, but lived, and that made every struggle, every tear, every impossible moment worth it. Clara closed the door on the past and stepped fully into her future, ready for whatever came next. Together, she and Caleb would face it. Together, they would build something that mattered. Together, they were home.